Good afternoon. I'm Dennis Galecki. Welcome to the 516th Imagine Greater Buffalo program and our 138th program hosted by our wonderful Buffalo and Erie County Public Library. That's 138 YouTube programs since September of 2020. Now, this program is created by the Center for the Study of Art, Architecture, History, and Nature, and ImagineLifelongLearning.com. Before we get started, just a little housekeeping. Everyone watching will be muted and your video turned off. If you have a question or comment, please type it into the chat box and we'll go through them at the end of the presentation. We are recording this program, so you can watch it again later on the Downtown Central Library's Facebook page and YouTube channels, and we certainly hope you share the links with others. Now, on to our featured speaker. This is part two. Keith Burich is an emeritus professor of history at Canisius University, having taught for 40 years at the school. His specialty is Native American history, and he has visited and taken students to reservations across the US and Canada. He has published numerous articles on Native Americans and, most importantly, written 2 books. Last week, he joined us to discuss the Thomas Indian School. This week, he will discuss his other book, We Remain: Race, Racism, and the Story of the American Indian. Keith, this is a wonderful 2-part session. You did a great job last week. Let's hear part 2. Take it away, please. Oh boy.
Well, thank you, Dennis. My book. My book, We Remain, examines race and racism in America through Native American history. Systemic racism is a troubling and controversial subject in America. Most Americans associate racism with the African Americans and slavery and its aftermath. They also believe that it is a thing of the past, a kind of an aberration in an otherwise exceptional history of America. And at any rate, it's become irrelevant after doing away with separate drinking fountains, passing the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and electing Barack Obama president. Therefore, there's no need for further remedies like affirmative action. Even the Supreme Court has weighed in on this and declared that America should be race neutral, colorblind, in other words. However, the history of Native Americans tells a far different story. Racism came to North America when the first Europeans set foot on the continent. Europeans believed that dark-skinned indigenous peoples, like the Native Americans, had an inherent and inherited inferiority. That allowed civilized Europeans to conquer, oppress, enslave, and even exterminate the indigenous peoples around the world. They were confirmed in this belief by popes in the 15th centuries, who declared with the doctrine of discovery that Christian nations could claim the lands, resources, and people of non-Christian lands, i.e. indigenous peoples. And Christian nations did just that. For centuries, they exported their racism around the world. In North America, the first contacts with Europeans between Indians and Europeans in the 15th centuries were for trade, mostly for furs, a trade that would last for several centuries. But it also involved a little-known trafficking in Indian slaves. Just as in Africa, slave traders went to North America to capture and export Indian slaves. It actually all began with Columbus. He saw a market in Indian slaves and took a boatload of Indian slaves, back to Spain after his first voyage. Slave traders rampaged through the interior of the North American continent, and taking their cue from Columbus, murdering, plundering, destroying villages and food supplies, taking captives and leaving survivors susceptible to starvation, exposure, and disease. The slaves, especially women and children, they were the prize captives. They were the ones that were in greater demand, were exported to other parts of various empires, mostly into the Caribbean and even to Bermuda. In fact, today you can go to Bermuda and there is a community consisting of the descendants of slaves, Indian slaves, exported to Bermuda from New England in the 17th century. The first slaves, therefore, in North America were Indians, not Africans. Later on, a couple centuries later, they would be the last freed after the Civil War. Between the 1500s and 1700, when the Indian slave trade began to diminish, more Indian slaves were exported than African slaves were imported into the American colonies. As I said, the Indian slave trade would begin to peter out by 1700 as Indians were pushed further and further west by a growing, burgeoning colonial population, and also by the warfare that drove them further west. And they also resisted the slave traders, setting off wars like the Pequot War in New England, which made the Indian slave trade more and more costly and inefficient. Therefore, colonial slave owners turned to African slaves instead of Indian slaves. But make no bones about it, every colony had Indian slaves and participated in the Indian slave trade. The Indian slave trade was important for other reasons. It established a pattern for future relations between Europeans and Indians over the next 400 years. Warfare would be total, with the destruction of villages and supplies and enslaving or killing of Indian women and children, which would have a negative impact on Indian fertility rates that would contribute to population decreases by 1900. Contrary to the belief that it was all diseases that killed the Indians, there's some people who say it was 95% of the Indians killed was due to diseases. It was a combination of warfare, killing and enslaving of women and children, and coupled with the removal, which was taking place almost immediately as the settlers moved onto the continent, and removing them from traditional lands to lands that were less fertile or less productive or harsher. All of that added up to a formula for genocide. A genocide that would take place not on an industrial scale like in Auschwitz during World War II, but slowly, gradually, as the man who coined the word genocide put it, Raphael Lemkin, as he put it, it was like a time bomb, ticking, ticking, ticking away until it finally exploded. And in this case, all the Indians would be gone. And that very well was nearly the case. All of that was fueled by racist beliefs that Indians, like all dark-skinned people, like the Africans, all indigenous people were inferior. When English settlers arrived on the North American continent to establish permanent colonies, they encountered Indians and described them as half-naked, dirty, promiscuous, heathens, because of course they weren't Christians. They spoke unintelligible languages. They had no permanent homes or villages, and they just simply roamed around the wilderness. The wilderness was a word they applied to North America, and it was an Old English word that meant where wild animals and presumably wild beings live. And those Indians who roamed around the wilderness, they didn't have any concept of private property or any idea on how to improve it. As one pilgrim said, despite all the happy talk about Thanksgiving, one pilgrim described them as, in fact, more like foxes and beasts than human beings. Therefore, in the end, they had no right to the land, no legal right to the land. They didn't deserve it because they didn't use it properly, despite all the abundance was around them. The Indians, of course, disagreed. They were quite happy and content. They had their own lifestyle and ways of living. And in fact, Europeans marveled at the fecundity of their gardens, which were smaller than English fields and farms, but more productive. This set off another round of warfare for the next 300 years. Most people don't realize that the battles lasted throughout these centuries, not just the epic battles that we always know, like the Battle of the Little Big Horn, or some of the other, or Wounded Knee, or Sand Creek, or some of the other more epic battles. They were constant battles. By some estimates, after 1776, after independence, the U.S. unleashed more than 1,000 forays against the Indians across the United States in the next century. In fact, the last Indian battle, something again most people don't realize, took place in 1923. The battles were ferocious, atrocities on both sides, including scalping. But it wasn't just the Indians that scalped. The Europeans scalped, and many people believe that actually scalping was done in Europe before the Europeans ever came to America and encountered Indians. And indeed, the colonial governments and state governments paid for Indian scalps right up in through the 19th century. And contrary to the depiction in Westerns on TV and in the movies, it wasn't Indians attacking defenseless, helpless settlers until the cavalry, John Wayne and the cavalry arrived. It was the cavalry who attacked the Indians. The Indians needed to be protected from them. The cavalry, and not just the federal cavalry or the regular military, but also state militias and even private groups, burned Indian villages, burned them with Indians in them, burning them alive, destroying everything, as I've already described, houses, supplies, and so on, including their horses and dogs. And then they would mutilate the bodies of dead Indians. They actually took Indian genitalia, male and female, for souvenirs. And they would display them when they returned from the battlefield to adoring crowds. They also flayed the skin of Indians. In New York, when General Sullivan was rampaging through Iroquois country and right in this area, and he instructed or suggested that his troops actually take Indian skins, tan them, and make them into leggings. Andrew Jackson, at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend in 1814, told his troops to go in, to follow the Indians into their dens. Of course, they don't live in houses, they're animals, so they live in dens, and kill their whelps. And in the process, take their skins to be made into leather goods. All of this sounds terribly ferocious and somehow un-American. But it was because Americans believed and would continue to believe what Thomas Jefferson said in the Declaration of Independence, that Indians were merciless savages. Merciless savages deserved no mercy. And Americans didn't show them any for the next century or so, until Indian wars finally ended in the 20th century. Eventually, the Indians were outgunned, outmanned, suffering from the afflictions of warfare, removal, they had the diseases, starvation, exposure. They, one by one, beginning on the East Coast and going right across the country, they would sign treaties to be removed from their traditional lands to somewhere out west. The treaties were signed were very often fraudulent, whether through bribery or trickery or force or alcohol. Indians signed away their lands in exchange for what was considered a refuge from hostile white settlers. Every Indian tribe, from the East Coast to the West, suffered their own trail of tears. We know about the trail of tears of the Cherokee in the 1830s after the Indian Removal Act of 1830. We know about the Choctaw and others that were headed out to Oklahoma. But every tribe had its own trail of tears as they were moved first across the mountains, the Appalachian Mountains, then across the Mississippi, and even further west once they got there. And the reservations were designed to protect them from hostile settlers and allow them to live in peace as Indians. But in fact, they were places to die, not live. Even after the fighting stopped, Indians continued to die on reservations. They had higher mortality rates, higher infant mortality rates, and they were what many Americans believed was a vanishing race. Put them on a reservation, and sooner or later they would disappear from Americans' consciousness and America's conscience. And indeed, they had proof that this was true. The new theory of evolution at that time, at the end of the 19th century, said, superior species replace inferior species. And indeed, they collected skeletons and skulls all across America. The Smithsonian had 19,000 skeletons or human remains in its storage. The Peabody at Harvard had 10,000. The Natural History Museum in New York had thousands. And there were thousands scattered all across the country as people studied the Indian remains, especially their skull capacity, to prove that they were in fact inferior and therefore a vanishing race. These reservations then, as I said, were not places to live, they were places to die. And in fact, they were really internment camps. Indians weren't allowed to leave. They couldn't get off, and the cavalry was stationed around them. You can look on a map and see all the number of the cities with forts in their name. They were usually around reservations to keep Indians in line and keep them on a reservation. Once there, they were deprived of everything that made them Indians, their religion. They weren't allowed to practice their religion until 1978. Their rituals, their traditions, their celebrations, everything was taken from them, including another element of genocide, their children, which were often sent to boarding schools. They are also deprived, of course, of the necessities of life: housing, food, clothing, medical care, sanitation, even water. And the result was that population declined until it reached its nadir in around 1890, 1900. It went from around 12 million in 1500. That's a controversial figure, but that's the one I use, to about less than 250,000 in 1890, 1900. Genocide was working, whether it was deliberate or not. And this would continue into the 20th century as Indians suffered from higher mortality rates and higher, especially infant mortality rates. Gradually, the Indian populations leveled off. Didn't bounce back immediately or very greatly, but because they were still around and because they still posed a problem, they were in the way. Their lands, people wanted their lands. Think about the story that's depicted in the movie the Summer Moon. They found other means to get rid of them. The Flower Moon, I'm sorry. Other means to get rid of them. There was forced sterilization, continued into the 1970s. Forced adoption, taking children away from their parents in the 50s and 60s. Foster care, giving their children over to white parents. Relocation, taking Indians out of reservations and putting them in cities. Termination, which simply did away with tribes entirely. The Seneca almost suffered from that. Taking away their lands. We know about that here as well. The Kinsua Dam, it flooded Indian lands on the Allegheny Reservation. The Power Authority Dam in Lewiston flooded the lands of the Tuscarora in Lewiston and Niagara Falls. Today, I've been on reservations for the past 25 years. The problems are still there. In some ways, and I wrote about this at some point, that the problems aren't all that much different than they were 100 years ago. They still have higher mortality rates, especially infants. Still have higher rates of poverty and unemployment and all the attendant problems that go along with them. Higher rates of alcohol and drugs, higher rates of suicide. When they go off the reservation, they have a criminal justice system that puts them in jail more often than any other portion of the population. And police actually kill Indians at a greater rate than the rest of the population. As I said, things haven't necessarily changed over the last 100 years. Yet as I traveled around and talked to people, as I said, I've seen some pretty serious problems, shed quite a few tears over them. Yet I also see people who are fiercely determined to stay where they are and stay Indian. They're buying back land that was taken from them. They're asserting their sovereignty, their ability to govern themselves, or as one Iroquois speaker said, and I always remember this, they want to carry their own water. They're still, in a way, they're still a very inconvenient and embarrassing reminder of the racism and of the past and of the present in America. The problem is they're not going anywhere. Hence the title of my book, We Remain. Thank you for listening. I hope I informed you and you found it interesting. Thanks. Are there any questions?
Certainly did, Keith. Thank you very much. A powerful presentation. Folks, this is your opportunity to submit some questions, create some dialogue. Keith, I'll ask you, 40 years of teaching, you've impacted a great many of students, younger probably predominantly, but certainly of all ages of Canisius, I would think. What's your sense of awareness, as you've experienced it? What happens when you present your understandings and historic research that you do?
Well, the awareness of natives and their and all of this history that I just sort of outlined, that was an outline of Native American history. Most people don't know much about it, including most students. I'll give you a little story. My daughter's in graduate school. She's teaching, needless to say, getting a PhD in Native American history. And in one of her classes is a TA. She's a TA. Some of the students said there are no more Indians alive.
Oops.
So, that is a real problem. I think I did a real service by taking students out to the reservations. They got to see firsthand what life was like on them. And I in the end, after about 16 years of taking them out and taking them to not only reservations out west, but to other sites of interest, they said their lives were changed. So I'm happy that I did that. And I tried to do that with the books that I've written and my speaking engagements. I really do want to try to inform people about Native American history. And I think my book does that.
Well, your presentation certainly now on YouTube will at least be out there for to serve the greater public. Dan,
Dennis,
how are we doing
have
for questions?
we do have a couple that have just come in. Bob
Great.
would like to know, could you expand on Native American slaves in New York State? Where and for whom did they work?
Well, every colony, by the time there were states, after the Revolution, there were no Indian slaves. They were done. Most of the Indian slavery ended by the beginning of the 18th century. And so most of them would have been in the eastern part of the state, and they would be working for the settlers, most of whom were farmers. So presumably that's what they did. And as I said, every colony had Indian slaves. And let me tell you a little story. There was a war, the Pequot War in 1636, 1637 in Connecticut. And they burned the village, the Mystic village along the Mystic River, and burned the inhabitants alive. The survivors were taken into slavery, including the governor of Massachusetts at that time, who took two home with him to be slaves for him. So I suspect that it ran the gamut. Anybody who needed extra labor in a country that was short of people at that point, population was pretty low, probably relied upon Indian slaves. That's the best I can estimate at this point.
I have one more here. Dr. Burich, what do you make of the fact that Indians are almost never portrayed today on television shows, in movies, or on game shows, for instance?
You're right. My wife and I often comment about this. Yeah, they're not portrayed. Although I think it's better today than it used to be. But when you start to think about not only whether they're on the TV shows and stuff, think about the way in which Indians are excluded from all sorts of things. We have a problem with racism. Nobody talks about Indians. They talk about African Americans and so on, and that's good. If you look at the way in which studies are done, they'll do studies of the entire population, and Indians are always included as other, or they're just simply excluded. Indians are invisible in America, and most people know very little about them. I've known people who are afraid to go on reservations because they've heard all kinds of horrible things about them. Very few people really have contact with Indians or know much about them. And again, that's what I'm trying to do, is inform the American public about Native Americans.
That's all we have for now, Dennis.
Good, and thank you. Keith, when everything is said and done, is there, and I think I was hearing it in your tone, as identity, youthful American Indians learning about their background, do you have a sense of optimism that something can evolve from where we're at, or are we doomed to just feeling down about the American Indian story?
It depends. It depends on the tribe. They're all, they're not monolithic. If you go to Rosebud in South Dakota, people are pretty pessimistic. Things are pretty bad there. On the other hand, there are people on Rosebud who said it's the richest place in the world because it's so beautiful and we have our own land and so on. It really depends on the individuals and on the tribes. But I do think, especially here in Western New York, the Indians are a lot more optimistic. For the Seneca, the casinos have certainly helped. They've pumped money into their reservations. And I think Indians are asserting their sovereignty, their desire to govern themselves separate from the government. So I think there is a sense of optimism overall, but it depends. It depends on the reservation. I have been on some like Crow in Montana where I have come away depressed. And I was there last year and I said I would never go back again. It was, things were so bad. So it's a hit or miss, and depends on the situation. And here things I think are a lot better. I'm sure there are some who will hear that and disagree with me.
Keith, I'll ask you too, as we wrap up, are there many of you out there relative to telling the story, as PhDs, as teachers, as whatever capacity, or are you and are you revered at some level for doing so?
Well, I'd like to think I was the only one, but no, I think it is much better today. When I first started teaching it back in the 90s, there were no books. There were nothing. And what books were written by white guys who didn't know anything. Today, there are plenty of books written by natives, including here, some of them here in Western New York. And there are now Indigenous studies programs. One at the University of Buffalo that's been started, and I think is a wonderful addition to that university. Like my daughter studying at Case Western Reserve University. There are more and more programs devoted to Native Americans. So I think it's catching on. I'm not alone, and I especially welcome natives to tell their own story.
Well, all I can relate to is my own experience in town. We have the Buffalo History Museum. Last Friday, they had the Red Jacket Award.
Right.
The Red Jacket Award had been repatriated to the Senecas. And there's growing awareness, I think, of our history, and by many an honest attempt to at least make note of the story and do the best we can moving forward.
Right.
And that's my optimism, and the way I'll leave this presentation. I think we're all challenged to do the best we can in our lifetimes to acknowledge things that are around us. Not be afraid of them. They happen. And now what can we do to do our little moment of improvement? Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, well, there's an old saying that applies to just about every situation in the world, and that is, before you can solve a problem, you got to admit that there is one. And that's been something I've been trying to do. I think my book tries to do. There was a real problem here for Native Americans, and you have to acknowledge that and understand it before you can do anything for it. And I think we're becoming more and more aware of it, at least. And I'm trying to do my small part in that process.
Well, it's a major part in the sense that it's rooted in the facts of the matter. That's what historians do. That's not a strong suit for America compared to other parts of the world, but you've done your part to hopefully inspire others to look into history fields and in the broader sense, and certainly American Indian history in the specific sense. So Keith, we'll wrap it up. Thank you very much for our two-part series. Double volunteer work on your part. Thank you. And a great story, most appropriate in this November period. So folks, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me and giving me an opportunity to spread the word.
You're quite welcome, Keith. All right. Well, the Imagine program is going to take a break for Thanksgiving next week. So we'll be back here on Zoom on Tuesday, November 28th, 2 weeks from today, with Dr. Phil Stokes. Now, Phil is the executive director of Penn-Dixie Fossil Park and Nature Reserve. it's been in the news the last few months for some great discoveries right here in our own backyard. So I know Dr. Phil Stokes is going to give us a great, energetic presentation. I'm Dennis Galecki, wishing you all, your families, a wonderful Thanksgiving. Thanking you all for participating in this program over the years. That has allowed us to continue on being part of it, supporting it. And especially I want to acknowledge and thank the staff at the Buffalo and Erie County Public Library. They make this possible and they host this program. And at Thanksgiving time especially, we should all be saying our thanks. And I want to certainly say mine to all of you and the library. Thanks, folks. Be well and good day.